Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you're joining us today. My name is Chelsea Domenico, and on behalf of Ethisphere, I'm pleased to welcome you to a webcast we're very excited to share with you today, Innovations in Sexual Harassment and Remediation. Over the next hour or so, you'll hear from my colleague Erica, as well as two expert leaders as they discuss the latest approaches and innovations companies are taking, as well as the data, what the data is telling us from Ethisphere's Culture Survey. If you've ever joined us for an Ethisphere Webcast before, you know that we love to take your questions throughout today's session. So I encourage you to use the question, answer, and chat functions you see within your webcasting experience. One thing in particular for this webcast is we want to allow you to communicate with one another, not only us, but as well as those joining. So we encourage you to engage. We are anticipating a handful of questions today. So if we do not get to your question, don't worry, we will follow up with you via email afterwards. Following the live webcast, you will receive an email from me, including the recording of today's webcast, the PowerPoint presentation you see here, as well as our #MeToo special report. For our Bella members joining us today, this also will be uploaded to your member hub under Ethisphere Resources. If you need assistance with your login to the member hub, or you have other members of your team that would like to have access, don't hesitate to send me a quick note and I'd be happy to set them up. I want to introduce you to our experts today. Many of you are already very familiar with my colleague Erica Salmon-Byrne, as well as Susan Divers, Senior Advisor at LRN. And joining them today is Anne-Marie Burns, Anti-Harassment Coordinator in the Ethics and Business Conduct Department at the World Bank Group. I do want to take a moment to highlight Anne-Marie's bio, as her role at the World Bank Group is a new position and is one of the many initiatives set forth in the action plan to address and prevent sexual harassment endorsed by WBG's President David Malpass in May of 2019. Anne-Marie, a Canadian national, joined the World Bank Group on October 15th, this past 2019, from the United Nations Dispute Tribunal in Geneva, where she worked as a legal officer on the resolution on employment relation disputes in the UN internal justice system. She brings 17 years of professional legal experience in international organizations and law firms, with specialized expertise in resolving harassment complaints through informal and formal mechanisms, conducting and reviewing internal and criminal investigations, and developing best practices to foster a harmonious working environment and gender mainstream initiatives. Anne-Marie brings a wealth of knowledge to today's conversation. We're thrilled to have her joining us. So let's jump right in. Erica, the floor is now all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chelsea. And let me add my welcome to yours, not only to the folks who are joining us on the line, but to Susan and Anne-Marie. The pre-calls for this particular webinar have been such a pleasure that I am really excited to share this conversation with all of you. So I just wanted to do a quick setup on the agenda, and then we're going to go ahead and dive right in because we've got a lot of information and data to cover with all of you today. So we're going to set the stage, talk a little bit about some statistics around harassment prevention, why this is such a topic that is so top of mind. And then we're really going to get into some of the things that Susan has seen companies do, that I have seen companies do, and that the World Bank is working on to give you some ideas of where you can take your program going forward. So you'll see our data portion of the conversation broken out here under section 2 to talk a little bit, to give some format to the conversation that we're going to have around each segment of this. So with that, and so that we waste as little time on this preview portion as possible, let's dive right in. But I do want to emphasize, please do send us your questions. I am confident that Susan and Anne-Marie could talk for the next hour about this topic, and it would be tremendously informative. But I know it's going to be even better if you tell us what's on your mind. So use that chat function, and I will be keeping an eye on it. So harassment prevention, some statistics. First off, why are we here and why are we talking about this right now? Susan, I'm going to go ahead and flip this first slide over to you and let you join in the conversation, because I know this is something that you have been looking at and talking about an awful lot over the course of the last year. So why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Thanks, Erica. And I want to say what a pleasure it is working with you again. You're just one of the best professionals in this field. So I really feel privileged to be on this webinar. And the question that is up on the screen, I think, is really a good question to ask whenever one approaches the sexual harassment issue And that's, why are these things continuing to happen? Why is harassment continuing to occur and scandals continuing to unfold? And if you look at a lot of the organizations caught up in these scandals, you and I both know, for example, that they have codes of conduct, that they have training, that they have detailed policies, probably written by some of the best outside law firms in the country. But that hasn't prevented sexual harassment scandals from unfolding. So let's look at a real quick quiz here. What elements do the Me Too scandals have with some of the other ethics scandals that we're seeing? And, you know, there could be a very long line here of companies named, but let's just settle for Volkswagen, Deutsche Bank, PG&E, and others. I'll read out the choices and then answer it. Organizations with detailed rules and policies, employees who reported the conduct internally, leaders who failed to act on the reports, retaliation against employees raising the concerns, substantial harm, all of the above. Well, the answer is clearly all of the above. So going on to the next slide, I'll flip it back. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Susan. And I do think the all of the above portion of it is an important piece of the conversation, because you know, this really goes to part of what you and Anne-Marie have been working on and thinking about at the World Bank, which is this idea that behaviors at the end of the day, you're really talking about behaviors, not controls, right? That is what a lot of these compliance conversations are about. You can have the best controls, as you said. You know, these are organizations that have beautifully written policies. They are airtight and, you know, have been constructed by some of the best lawyers in the country. They have great training, you know, that they send everybody through as required by the various pieces of legislation that have been passed around the globe on this topic. But at the end of the day, what you are asking people to do is think differently about their behaviors in the workplace. And that is a very different conversation that requires us to sort of step out of that legal and regulatory box and think more broadly. So I do think it's worth pausing for a moment on this all of the above answer, because it really goes to that idea that at the heart of all of this is really about behavior. So one of the things I wanted to take a quick moment to share is a little bit of data from our culture work, because it really does emphasize Susan's broader point around where these issues are happening and where they continue to happen. So first, to set just a little bit of context, the size of the data set at this point is north of 550,000 current employee responses. We have answers from 70 companies around the world, representing the points of view of somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 million employees. And what we see in that data is a couple of things that should matter a lot to anybody who's thinking about harassment prevention. The first is that the vast majority of employees, Chelsea, if you want to go ahead and skip to the next slide, the vast majority of employees, when they have an issue or a concern, take that to their manager, right? They go to the person that they interact with most regularly, followed 42% of the time by the human resources representative, but more often than not, they are taking a concern that they have to their manager. That means that it's incumbent upon companies to make sure that managers are prepared for that kind of activity and that they know what to do when somebody raises a concern to them, because the experience that an employee has there has a tremendous impact on how they feel about their professional future at the organization. So Chelsea, if you skip to the next slide, I can share with you all some data on how people feel about the process of reporting. So what you see is 60% of people going to their manager and just 60% of those people being satisfied with how the process went. It is one of the lower satisfaction rates that we see across the data set. Good news for all of you on the phone is people are much happier with the compliance and ethics folks and how that process went. So, you know, kudos to all of you, but immediate reporting to your immediate manager is something that still is an area of challenge for organizations. So, and why does that matter in this particular context? Well, Chelsea, if you'll go to the next slide, it matters because harassment and discrimination broadly are still the most commonly observed type of misconduct. So one of the questions we ask in this survey is, if you observed misconduct, what did you see? And harassment or discrimination leads the pack for every organization that we work with. So that means that you've got, to break it down, you've got employees who have, who observe harassment or discrimination broadly. You have them more often than not going to their manager to talk about that particular observation. And then often you have a manager that doesn't necessarily know what to do with that particular situation. Even setting aside a situation where the manager, could potentially be involved in it. And then the other thing I'll point out to all of you, even though I didn't highlight it, is retaliation or intimidation is a quarter of the data set in terms of observed misconduct. So I know one of the things that we'll get into in just a moment is how you deal with kind of post-investigation making a work unit whole again. But retaliation or intimidation is still something that a lot of individual employees are observing. So if we go to the next slide, Anne-Marie, I wanted to pull you into the conversation before we got too far into the dialogue, because one of the things that we have talked about a lot about is the way that the World Bank is approaching the harassment prevention process writ large. And one of the pieces of that, of course, is even figuring out kind of what numbers are you dealing with? How many cases do you have? What does it look like? What does the universe look like? So I know we're going to talk about the transparency component of what the World Bank has done in a moment, so I won't ask you to get into that piece, but can you talk a little bit about the challenge of getting clean data and figuring out kind of how big a problem you have more generally?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Erica. And perhaps we could go to this slide with the numbers of the World Bank Group, and then I can explain a little bit where we stand. So we have a similar kind of share of allegations that are dealing with harassment and sexual harassment. In our case, if we look into our numbers, we received in last fiscal year, which ended on July 1st, 2019, we received 224 allegations within the ethics office, and 113 of them were related to harassment or sexual harassment. So more than 50% of the allegations that we received were dealing with these two issues. So we really stand in the same way as the kind of numbers that you are reporting. We gather similar data as you reflected in your survey in terms of what kind of allegations we receive, although our categories are a little bit different, but we also collect these data. And I don't know if you want me to go a bit into at this stage, Erica, into how we handle these allegations and what is the result of our investigation process, which is this other slide that you are showing now. So perhaps to give an overview to the participants, because the World Bank Group is an international organization which enjoys privileges and immunities, people cannot go out of the World Bank Group to solve their employment-related disputes. They cannot go to national court, and we are not bound by national laws. So everything is internal. So we have within our ethics office an investigation department, which was up until recently the main way to deal with allegations of harassment and sexual harassment, and in fact any other type of misconduct. And what we saw is that if we look a bit into the investigation mechanism that we have, is that we lost a lot of cases straight from the intake process, which is the very first step where an investigator would meet with a reporter and examine whether the allegations, if they were to be substantiated, would amount to misconduct. So at this very first stage, like half of the cases were disappearing from our system because the allegations although they would perhaps raise some concerns, would not necessarily amount to misconduct. And then down the line, you could see that during the preliminary inquiry, where the investigators actually interview a couple of witnesses, review a little bit of evidence, but not yet very much in detail, another 74 cases were lost. So again, we were losing cases throughout the process because a lot of these harassment and sexual harassment cases would not reach to the level of misconduct that will eventually be found to be misconduct and lead to some sanctions. So and then I don't know, Erica, if you want to, that I delve now a bit into what the bank did to address these cases that we felt, you know, there was inappropriate behavior. There was some kind of perhaps beginning of an harassment pattern, but not yet to the level that we could discipline people. And this is where we came out with an action plan to do things a bit differently.
So let's hold on that piece just for a moment, Anne-Marie, because I do want to corroborate some of what you're describing with a little bit of additional data. So Chelsea, if you would pop to slide 15 just for a second. Go ahead and go, yep, right there. And so, Anne-Marie, what you just described is, I think, something that is very typical of the organizations that are on the line and the other organizations that we work with, which is bifurcated investigation teams. So you talked a little bit about, you know, sort of EBC investigations, investigators looking into things, and things being inside or outside of their particular mandate. And what you see on the slide in front of you is some data from a survey that we ran with the Bella community earlier this year, or last year, I guess, rather now, since it's 2020, which shows sort of the breadth of potential investigators across an organization. So for many organizations, you could have harassment-related investigations living in HR. You could have some of them potentially coming into compliance or the legal team, or other groups. And, you know, about a quarter of the companies that responded indicating that they have a standalone investigations unit that looks into things as well. So Anne-Marie, can you talk a little bit about sort of who is responsible inside the bank for conducting investigations and how those groups work together? And then I'll pull Susan into the conversation after that.
Yes, okay. So for us, the investigation department, which sits in the ethics office, is the one responsible for all fact-finding investigations. So cases to go kind of through the formal route and eventually lead to disciplinary sanctions need to come to the investigation department. Other actors like HR can advise staff, can look into issues, can, you know, sometimes resolve issues that are not so serious as to amount to misconduct. They can resolve them informally, but anything that has to do with a disciplinary sanction will need to be investigated through our ethics office. Yet we have other mechanisms to help as well people resolve things informally. These include, beyond HR, there is an ombuds services where people can go and discuss these things informally, and the ombuds can talk to the people and try to resolve things. But this is not recorded. There's no report of that. So the problem with that that we faced is that when there is repetition of behavior, there's no record of what has been done before. And the other actor that we have is also, you know, the mediation department, where they can put, you know, people sitting together, talking through their issues, and then reaching some sort of a formal agreement. But typically, this was not so much used for issues that really deal with sexual harassment. And sometimes in harassment, but with sexual harassment, this was not a process that tended to be used very much.
Right, right. Chelsea, would you advance to the next slide? Thank you. And Susan, do we have you back with us?
Yeah, I'm back.
Oh, good. Okay. So what I'm showing right now is another data cut that is particularly related to harassment investigations. And what we see here is about 70% of the data set indicated that that those are primarily the domain of human resources, with 13% indicating compliance. And Anne-Marie, I think a lot of folks listening in you know, are admiring the fact that you guys do have a single group that at least is going to run what would rise to the level of an actual investigation. So, Susan, is this consistent with how you see the organizations that you work with addressing harassment-related claims, and any thoughts on this data related to who's actually doing investigations?
Yes, Erica, that is consistent with what we see in our practice at LRN. And I think what you stressed a couple of minutes ago, though, that this is not really a controls issue at heart. This is a behavior issue. What we're seeing is that ethics and compliance is playing much more of a key leadership role in asking people to think more in terms of values rather than rules. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But, you know, what we are seeing is a shift away from too much focus, I would say, on let's list all the possible things that could constitute sexual harassment. I mean, that list could be very long, and later I'll get into an example that really illustrates that. So even though HR is still predominantly doing the investigations, I think these stats could risk obscuring that ethics and compliance professionals, in our view, are really stepping up to the plate to look at values and to look at really influencing behavior, as well as, you know, obviously investigating allegations when they come to the front. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, absolutely. And Susan and Anne-Marie, we got a great question that came in from the floor, and I think it was prompted by some of the comments that Anne-Marie was making about the fact that that there are other informal avenues to resolve issues that don't necessarily rise to the level of sanctionable behavior. And the question is, how do you ensure that you have a sense of what those cases or issues might be? So how do you partner with human resources or the ombudsman or other parts of the organization to get a sense of what might be happening that is not necessarily coming in through your channels? Anne-Marie, any thoughts on how you've addressed that at the bank, or you know, potential guidance in response to that question?
Yeah, okay, my position that was recently created is meant to help, in fact, to coordinate all these various resources that deal with issues of harassment and sexual harassment, but it's been, you know, created recently. But what I can say is that we work in close cooperation with ombuds and staff association, for instance. And when we share a lot of information, within, you know, as well, this obligation to respect some confidentiality level, but we share kind of some sort of metadata to kind of collect an overview as to what kind of issues each of them face within, you know, a fiscal year. So ombuds typically make a report of the cases that they receive, the trends, and they give them numbers. We give ours. Where we don't necessarily have data is HR, because these things are really dealt informally. So we don't really have any kind of input from the HR perspective. But however, I must say that as far as I'm aware, at the bank, HR is not kind of the primary resource that people would go to if they have an issue. However, what tends to happen is that if people go to HR, HR tends to also come to us, or to refer people to us or to ombuds. So this is a bit how we work. Perhaps in our institution, HR is a bit less involved in resolving these issues than in others.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. So from our perspective, one of the things that we see companies doing is obviously trying to move to a single consolidated case management system. That's an initiative that a lot of companies have taken in response to Me Too allegations, in particular with boards and other kind of supervisory organizations asking for consolidated reporting so that they can understand how much exposure the organization might have to Me Too related issues. So moving to one consolidated case management system is a piece of it. Of course, that only helps if something rises to the level of a case, such that it's in the case management system in the first place. But we're also seeing a lot of ad hoc committee work, pulling together, as Susan mentioned, the ethics and compliance team with other control functions across the organization to try and extract some of those insights and thoughts from those who are interacting in those more informal ways. The other thing we're seeing a lot is a focus on how the investigations team is communicating with known reporters. So Chelsea, if you'll go ahead and go to the next slide, one of the data points I wanted to share with all of you was some of the innovative ways that companies are trying to follow up with reporting individuals. Obviously, if it's a known reporter, this is easier than it is if it's not a known reporter, but it is one of the things that companies are starting to look at more and more regularly to say, how do we make sure that this person is kept informed as we move through the process? So whether it's some sort of automatic reply that comes in when you raise a concern, or another process that the investigators are trained to take, those are some of the things that we're seeing organizations look at very closely. And Anne-Marie, I know this is something that you've looked at. How are the people who raise concerns being communicated with as they move through the process and after the process? So would you take a moment and just talk a little bit about some of the steps you're taking to make sure that people who raise concerns feel like they're heard?
Yes, okay, thanks, Erica. On that one, I would say that, there are currently now two approaches within our ethics office, which is myself as a resource to deal with cases in a more informal manner, and still, the more formal route where the investigators are doing, a formal investigation. So here I understand that you're talking more about keeping reporters informed of the progress of an investigation and the outcome also of an investigation. Is that right?
That was the focus of the question, but if you have things you're doing with individuals who don't rise to the level of a reporter, I'm sure the audience would find those helpful as well.
Okay, so if I'm talking first about the investigation process, traditionally, I would say reporters were not given much information. There was this approach that we needed to preserve confidentiality of the whole thing. And these were concerns that were raised, for instance, that we have internally a sexual harassment working group. And this was one of the concerns that was brought on behalf of the reporters or the aggrieved individuals, that he needed to have more information. So what we are moving towards is to have, after an investigation has been completed, to have kind of a synopsis of the investigation report to be given to the reporter. The new trend as well is to keep the reporter informed throughout the process of the major steps, including in our system, the moment where the alleged offender is informed of the charges. So when they've passed kind of the preliminary stage, which normally remains fully confidential, then when they are moving forward with a formal investigation and charging a subject, then they inform the reporter. So there are these steps that are taken to keep better informed. We're not yet giving that kind of information to the witnesses unless they were themselves affected by the alleged misbehavior. But we don't otherwise keep all the witnesses informed of the thing. We felt it was kind of pushing it a bit too far in terms of divulging information that could be prejudicial to the subject or even to the conduct of the investigation.
Susan, any thoughts on what you see organizations doing in this area that you would add to Anne-Marie's summary?
Yeah, I'd like to highlight one really innovative practice we've come across, which is a large mining company based in Canada actually pioneered quick surveys at the end of investigations. Everybody that checks into a hotel these days gets a quick survey when they check out. And I like the idea. I think it was very innovative the idea was to make it short, sweet, and fast. So let's say you make an allegation and for whatever reason it's not substantiated, or at the end of a process where it is, a decision is reached, replying to people with the results, but then asking them to take a 5-question feedback survey on what was the process fair. Were they treated with respect? Did they agree or disagree with the results and comments? I think that's a great way to build trust, and it's one that I really think is worth thinking about in this type of process.
Yeah, and Susan, what we're showing on the screen now is a little bit of data from that same investigation survey that we did, and you can see about 8%, 9% of the companies that took the survey indicated that they do something similar. And I do think it's a really good point to figure out how do people feel about going through the process, because one of the things that we generally see in the data is that your experience going through the process definitely influences your willingness to raise a concern again, right? Are you going to come back to the compliance team the next time you have a question about something or a concern about something? The way that you were treated during the process is obviously really important. And particularly one of the things that I like seeing is, questions about how you feel about how you were treated by the investigators. Did you feel like you were respected as you moved through the process? It can be really important, especially if you're an organization that relies on the backgrounds of your investigators to make sure that, from an experience perspective, making sure that people feel like, if your investigations team is made up of former FBI officials, they're going to do an investigation with a certain kind of style. And that may or may not be the style that you want your investigators doing investigations with, right? And some of these follow-up processes can really be important as you work your way through that. I've gotten a bunch of questions coming in from the floor about whether the slides will be available. Yes, and everyone who registered for the webinar will get the slides and the recording at the end of today's conversation. So hopefully everybody will keep an eye on their email for all of the various pieces of today's dialogue. Going to the next slide, and this is another thing, Susan and Anne-Marie, that we talked about a little bit during the prep conversation, is how to keep an eye on employees that have gone through an investigation process to try and suss out any leading indicators of potential retaliation. So this is a question we've been asking for a couple of years now, and we've seen some really interesting trending. Of course, the most commonly chosen response is informing the reporting individual of the company's non-retaliation policy. Hopefully your non-retaliation policy is written at a reading level that your employees can understand it. That's one of the things, to go to Susan's point about policies that are written by some of the best lawyers. Often those policies written by the best lawyers are the least understandable to the average employee. So I definitely encourage you to take a look at the language in your own policy and figure out whether you think it's something that will actually resonate with your employee base. That is a very common response, but we're seeing some other more creative approaches. So monitoring changes in job status or in performance evaluations is something that is becoming more common. Looking at trends, changing trends in sick time to indicate the possibility that someone is having a hard time coming into work post an investigation. And Anne-Marie, this is a place that I would like to pull you in, because I think some of what the board, or what the World Bank has done rather, in creating your position to make work units whole again post an investigation is a really innovative approach to the way that you are thinking about the process. And so, one of the things that we discussed during the prep call is, in an environment like the bank, there's a lot of it's a universe of places with very unique job opportunities. And so the idea that you could raise a concern and have it impact your job prospects is something that is very top of mind for bank employees. So can you talk a little bit about, philosophically speaking, how have you seen this change at the bank, and kind of this focus on, let's make the work unit work again post an investigation?
Yeah, you touched a very important point for us here, which is the fear of retaliation. It is huge at the bank. Not only it's a limited, limited career prospect for people, to go outside the bank because they become extremely specialized, but also a lot of them are on short-term contracts. A lot of them are on G4 visas. So if they lose their employment with the bank, the non-US citizens are kicked out of the country and they need to relocate. So fear of retaliation is huge. What we do now in terms of part of my role, in fact, is to monitor the situation after an investigation has been completed, and to follow up with the reporter, with the affected unit, with the manager in charge of the unit, to see first whether the alleged misbehavior has stopped, but also to ensure that there's no retaliation. And of course, my role is new, and I haven't talked yet about these monitoring, for instance, of sick leave and these kind of things. But I would hope that when talking to the reporter, if they have issues in terms of continuing to work in the unit and so forth, they will tell me, and then we can double check with report on sick leave, and same for performance appraisal. And indeed, if there is a drop in the performance appraisal, this is definitely an area where we would go back to the manager and say, here we have questions. We had someone who reported misconduct, went through an investigation, and suddenly there's a drop in the performance evaluation. So there may be good reasons, but we'll definitely ask some questions. So the idea is to follow up. We have as well a mediation unit which provides some till building services. So after an investigation, especially in small country offices where people work kind of as a family, the impact of an investigation may be really huge. So we have these facilities with the mediation division to have some team building exercises afterwards, to ensure that people are put back together. Another part of my job as well that has kind of a preventive effect in terms of retaliation, and it happened even to me already in some cases, is to, even before an investigation starts, when people come to me and they have concerns, they want to report misconduct, but they are really afraid of retaliation, for instance, in the performance evaluations. I've already worked now with directors to put in place some measures to have some variation in the evaluation process and ensure that there's additional oversight given the particular circumstances of an upcoming investigation. So we try to be a bit proactive and not to wait until it happens, but to send a signal as well to those who are under investigation that we will monitor closely the situation. And if, suddenly something strange happens, we'll be there immediately to ask questions.
Perfect. And Susan, I know one of the things that you and I have talked a lot about is the organizational justice component of all of this, and the question of, to what extent, it's one thing to say, here are our policy expectations across the organization. It's another thing to discipline the highest performing salesperson, right? And I know that you have some strong thoughts on the organizational justice component and some of the ways that you can move that. So Chelsea, if you would go ahead and hop to slide 22, I'd love to hear Susan's thoughts on this question of, executive leaders that are willing to sanction high performers for misbehavior.
Thanks, Erica. And I think it gets back to the question we started with, which is, why does this keep happening despite lots of controls and lots of investment in sexual harassment, team investigations and remediation? And I recently wrote a white paper on this with John Drimmer, who's at Paul Hastings. And we looked at a lot of research, and one of the absolute fundamental planks that determines whether an ethics and compliance program actually has traction when it comes to behavior is the question of organizational justice. And interestingly, as a bit of an aside, to get ready for the webinar, I was looking at some surveys, And last year, PwC's CEO Success Survey, for the first time in 20 years, found that the main reason CEOs were dismissed was because of misconduct and ethical failing. So that's a pretty sobering statistic when you think about it, but it can be a sign that people are starting to get that. And at LRN, we talk about values and we talk about moral leadership, which I think is a very good area to focus on. And then we look at whether people are actually exercising moral leadership in evaluating whether programs are effective. And what we see is that high impact programs that actually take values seriously and aren't just on paper or a long checklist, really show that kind of moral leadership because they support effective sanctions that also have to be fair and transparent on executives and high performers involved in misconduct. And if you look back at some of the scandals, particularly at some of the media companies, it was clear that there was one set of rules for everybody but the CEO or the C-suite, and you simply won't have a program if that's the case.
Yep, and that transparency piece, I think, is an important component piece of what we're seeing companies do in many cases in response to some of these issues. Chelsea, if you'll go ahead and go to the next slide. This is a question that we've been asking for a couple of years now about the extent to which companies are willing to be transparent with how many concerns were reported, the types of concerns reported, and the results of the reports and investigations writ large, right? So this is not necessarily talking about sharing the specific details of what might have happened to an individual person, but aggregated data. And what we have seen over the course of the years is a real shift in the number of companies that are making information more and more available to organizations. So Chelsea, if we go to the next slide, what you have here is some screenshots of some of the work that the World Bank has done. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time with this, particularly to commend the team at the World Bank for releasing this information, because one of the things that we have seen impact the organizational justice numbers, which is something we always ask about as part of our culture work, is this idea of being more and more transparent with what is coming in, to give employees a sense of scope and scale, as well as the steps an organization will take when an issue is raised. So if you are thinking there is a chance that inside your organization there is a perception that it's simply not worth raising a concern because nothing's going to happen anyway, one of the very best things you can do to counter that and move that sentiment is something like what the World Bank has done. So Anne-Marie, I'm going to turn it over to you to talk a little bit about, this idea of issuing these reports. These are publicly available, by the way, everyone. You can go to the World Bank site and you can see them. So this idea of releasing this information, pulling these kind of statistics together, and the work that you had to do to get there.
Yeah, this has been done now for 2 years in a row, where yes. In its annual report, the ethics office is now disclosing all its statistics. So what comes in, what kind of allegations, how many, how are they handled by the process, what's the result? And what's the result has been internally, I must say, a big fight, because there was a lot of reluctance to actually even go as far now as publishing the list of cases with a synopsis, divulging, the nature of the allegations, the rank of the person, and what was actually the sanction that was given by, in our system, it's the Vice President for Human Resources who makes the sanction. But now we make this all available, and the blog where we actually, for the first time, put public internally all these cases that were sanctioned was the blog that was the most open in the history of the bank. So there was a huge interest from staff, from management, to read about these cases and to finally understand, what's going on with all these cases that are handled, before it was in all obscurity. Nobody knew what was reported and what was the outcome. So this really went a long way for people to gain trust in the system, to see that things were happening, things were moving forward. And we acknowledge as well that indeed, with these numbers, we can see, as I shared with you before, that the investigation system that we have is not always effective to resolve these inappropriate behaviors. So we also, very much transparently take stock of that and say to people, now that's why we want to address these things a bit differently. So in terms of transparency, what we've done as well now for 2 years is to have a special report on sexual harassment. Following the Me Too campaign, I mean, the bank, like all other institutions, was heavily touched by this. There was a huge increase in terms of reporting of allegations of sexual harassment. And internally, which I found was very nice, there was a movement at the high level, including the General Counsel, to form a sexual harassment working group. And this group has been very active in bringing, the issues up to the table. And this is where we decided, okay, we need to report really specifically on sexual harassment every year, build an action plan, and be held accountable before the sexual harassment working group to show that we are, we are walking the talk and taking really action on these topics.
And Anne-Marie, to the extent that you can address it, you talked a little bit about the fact that it was a topic of much discussion, kind of talking about what the discipline was. How did because this is a question I get all the time, and if I don't ask it, I can guarantee you we're going to have 4 people typing in from the floor to ask how you got there. How do you get to a place where, as an organization, you are comfortable sharing that kind of information? Because what I often hear from labor and employment lawyers in particular is, well, it's so fact specific. I can't possibly share the discipline because every case is different.
Yeah, I think what makes a big difference is to have kind of the right tone set from the top. So in our case, this idea of becoming more transparent was part of the action plan proposed by the ethics office and then submitted to the president of the bank. And the bank's president was the one who really launched the action plan. So yeah. We managed to get support really at the highest, at the highest level within the bank, which is, I think, what was the trigger to get this movement going on. Because of course, then we had to convince the vice president for human resources to give us access to his sanctions yep. and to publish them and to be accountable as well for ensuring that these are, proportionate and that he's treating people, on the same page and not, favoring, for instance, high-level people, which was the perception of staff that, high flyer would get lower sanctions than, STCs, which are our short-term consultants. So, yeah. But I think, the tone from the top is really key there.
Yeah. Absolutely. Anne-Marie, got a question that came in from the floor about your sexual harassment working group. Curious about how big is it, who's on it, who leads it, any kind of details that you're willing to share about that particular approach that you're taking.
Yeah, I mean, this was frankly created informally, which I think is also why it was so successful. It was really people who were engaged into these issues. And it started with, a country director, which is for us in our structure, quite high level, and then mm-hmm. joined there the vice president, the legal vice president, so the senior counsel of the bank. So very top level people got involved into that, and then they managed to join other key players like HR, our office, ombudsman, the staff association. So they managed to kind of collect informally support from key players, but who are also deeply interested into these issues.
Fascinating. And so it's really multidisciplinary.
Yes, it is. It is, and it is also still a bit informal. So, people join this group and then some people then move and are replaced by others. So it's still very much voluntary. And I would say that what they actually do is that they carry the voice of affected people, not to call them victims, but They are there to raise these issues, to support aggrieved individuals, and they bring some sort of moral support to the issue.
Perfect. That's great. Susan, have you seen anything similar in your work?
I haven't seen that kind of bottoms-up approach that Anne-Marie is describing, Erica, but to go back to the question of being transparent, one of my favorite examples is actually the Pentagon for years has been publishing the Encyclopedia for Ethical Failures. And if you Google it, it'll pop up. And, you know, for an organization that most people think of as highly protective of data and secrets and knowledge or limiting access, I should say, the Pentagon really does an amazing job. I was just looking at it today, in fact, and they have examples of generals, no names given, but very specific facts and what exactly happened as a result. And I think, you know, not only does that build trust in your system, but it also serves as a way of training and informing people that the organization isn't going to tolerate this type of behavior without spending too much time sort of going through the rules and instead giving examples.
That's a great point. So Anne-Marie and Susan, I want to spend the last couple of minutes that we have together talking, kind of circling back around to where we began, which is the critical role of the manager in harassment prevention, and this idea of really moving beyond the regulatory and the legal piece and into something that is more behaviors related. So Chelsea, if you go ahead and jump down to slide 28 in the presentation deck. Susan, I'm going to turn the floor to you to talk a little bit about these next couple of slides, which is some of the ways in which you are seeing companies really target the manager group and try to push on that lever to change behaviors.
Sure, Erica. Before I do that, though, I do want to make one, I think, important point, which is that, again, I think there's too much emphasis, and I hear it time and time again, on coming up with a list of things that you can't do because those would be either harassment or sexual harassment. And I think that's a blind alley and a red herring, because I've seen even a case where a senior woman in a company was sending an administrative assistant who was in her 60s greeting cards and gifts that were worn out and soiled, and then coupling that with saying, you know, this is like you're over the hill. Well, I mean, that's really troubling and disturbing, but you can't put, you know, gifts and greeting cards on the list. So in looking at what managers can do and what other people can do as well, and I've got some slides on that, really helping managers understand this issue and focusing on preventing it and focusing it on listening to what people have to say about it and drawing out feedback from their teams is really the focus of a lot of our training efforts, as you can see, and doing the same with allies, people who support victims of harassment, so that it takes a lot to bring a claim or to bring a complaint. And if it's your manager, for example, or your director, then it's even more challenging. So again, rather than focusing, you know, on adding another, you know, list of prohibited practices or on updating your policy, take a look at, as Anne-Marie has done at the World Bank, what does the ecosystem look like? And how do you really create conditions so that people can come forward, and so these things can be dealt with? And not all of them do rise to the level of an investigation, but if you deal with them at an early stage, I think you really have a much better chance of preventing it getting to that stage where it becomes actual harassment and all. So managers, allies, and then I think we've also got a slide on bystanders, because frequently in harassment situations, people are aware that it's going on, but they're uncomfortable, of course, and these are delicate issues to raise. So encouraging people to talk about it and to raise it in the right channels. And your data, of course, shows that managers are the overwhelming choice in that area, but also educating everyone on, how to make this whole so that you're not just left with a smoldering wreck after there's been a harassment investigation. I think that's a good takeaway thought.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Anne-Marie, anything to add from your experience that you would use to illuminate this?
Yeah, I also truly believe that managers are key, and frankly, in my role now, they are my key partners. I've been only here for 3 months, but I had so many VPs, directors, asking me, come to my management meeting, make a presentation, discuss issues of harassment. So I'm very much engaging with them as partners to tackle these issues, and they're very much interested to that. We have as well developed some key trainings within our ethics office, which is good because we're dealing with investigation, advisory, and also training within the same office. So when we identify trends, we then convey them through our trainings. And what we've developed for now a couple of years is what we call a training on creating a respectful workplace, which is kind of a facilitated conversation with a team, including the management of that team. And we practice how to be bystanders, how to intervene, how if we are victim of a situation where we receive unwelcome behavior, how to say no, how to convey the message that it's not welcome, how manager can help intervene if needs be. So we actually practice people to do it. We have as well a specific course with managers, which is again more a conversation as to how as managers they should handle these situations. What are their obligations to report, but what also are the cases that they should handle themselves. And part of my role as anti-harassment coordinator is also, when a manager has an issue in a team, an issue, for instance, of sexual harassment, they can come to me and we can discuss and coach them as to how to resolve it by themselves. Sometimes they need my help, and then I can intervene with them and talk to an alleged offender and say, here, we've got a problem. You need to change your behavior because you're not in line with the bank's values or with the bank's code of conduct, whatever may be the case. So we provide them a resource to handle the situation. And I think this is very key to address these behavior, especially before they actually escalate to misconduct.
Right. And I do think, Anne-Marie, that's a really important point, right? Because very often, there are things that happen before it rises to the level of misconduct that a well-positioned manager can get out in front of. And one of the things that I see a lot of companies doing right now that I'll add to your and Susan's excellent advice is talking to managers about, particularly in this labor market, talking to managers about the challenges when you lose someone, right? Because we all know from the Me Too report that we did about 1.5 years ago, one of the stats that we have in that report is that somebody who experiences or witnesses harassment is 3 times more likely to leave the organization, right? And that kind of that cost, that people cost, that time cost, the productivity cost, if you start from a place of you've got great people on your team and you want to hold on to them, and that's why we're asking you to be aware of and part of this conversation, it sometimes is a little bit easier to get managers' attention. Well, wonderful. Well, Susan and Anne-Marie, thank you so very much for taking an hour out of your day to spend with this audience. I know based on the questions that came in that we had a very engaged group that really cares a lot about this topic, and hopefully they all left with a couple of things that they can take back to their organizations and implement. So my profound thanks to each of you for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks to you,
No,
Erica,
Erica.
for inviting me.
And with that,
Yes,
as I
it was a
mentioned,
total pleasure.
yeah, you'll get the recording and the slides. There were a few questions that did come in during the course of the webinar that we did not have a chance to get to. We'll be following up with you directly via email following the conclusion of the conversation. So thank you all for taking some time out of your day to spend with Susan and Anne-Marie and I, and we'll look forward to having you on our next webinar.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.